And this is a lecture about Chapter 53 in the Pearson text for AP Biology. And today I'm going to talk about populations. So populations, here we are in our big spectrum kind of thing from the individual all the way up to the biosphere. And here's a population. So a population is a group of organisms that are all in the same species, that are all living together in the same area, and that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So that's where we are in the big picture. I want to talk a little bit about measuring populations. There's lots of different measurement types methods for measuring populations, and one of them is to just physically count. So you can measure off a square. This is usually like a meter by something that's macroscopic that you can see, and you can physically count. But sometimes that's a little bit difficult to be able to do that. So we have some other ways of estimating populations, and one of them is called the mark and recapture method. So you've probably seen this on TV, right, where an organism is marked or banned with put some kind of marker on there that hopefully doesn't wash off, and then you do what we call the mark and recapture method, and so you know the number of organisms that you have caught and marked, and then at some point you go back and then do a second catch. And then you look in the second catch of how many of those second catch organisms also had the marks that you put on. And then you can set up a ratio and you can calculate the total population number, which is what you're trying to go for, of n. So here's a problem that you can pause the video and try to work out. To measure a population density of chipmunks in a particular park, you capture 50 chipmunks. That's here, right? You mark them with a small little red dot of red paint and then release them. And then the next day you come back and capture another 50 chipmunks. So there we go right here with our second catch. And among those 50s in your second catch, you find that 10 of them are already marked. What is the total population of the chipmunks in that area? What is n? So you can pause the video, do that, see what you get, and I'll let you do that, and then I will tell you the answer is 250, right? So if you got 250, you got the right answer. So I want you to do kind of some thinking here about this. Suppose one of these problems happen. You later discover that one of the areas that you sampled is more favored by chipmunks. How is that going to affect your data? Or you later discover that the chipmunks are licking the marks off each other's backs. How would that affect your data? So you need to look back at that ratio specifically and see which of those four numbers is going to be affected. Or you later discover that the marked chipmunks were easier to see and therefore more susceptible to predation. How would that affect? So try to think about those problems. A lot of times in AP Biology class, we'll do just a simple yeast population lab, and we'll look at a question like, how does the sugar type affect the yeast population growth? So we want to find a way to measure our yeast population. Well, there's a couple of different ways that we can do that. And here, yeast are microscopic fungi, and here's what those little cells look like. We know they reproduce by budding, and we put them in some media that has some kind of sugar, and they will grow. So one of the ways that we can do that is directly counting. So we can get a grid microscope that has these little microgrids that you can see under the microscope, and we can take a sample of a certain volume and we can put it on the microscope, and then we can look and count, and then we would know how many yeast cells are in that particular grid, and then we can make an estimate based on how many grids we have, and then based on the volume of the sample that we put onto our slide. Another way that we can do that is we can estimate using a colorimeter. So a colorimeter is going to measure changes in concentration, right? The light that is going through the detector. And so as the population grows more, it's going to become more cloudy. So less light would go through, and that gives us an indication of this. So part of the problem with this is that this also would not differentiate between living cells and cellular debris, right? So if it could become cloudy with just cellular debris, so that's one bad um, um, aspect to that particular population count. And the other one is just, error, human error in physically counting. So there's pros and cons to these different methods. So I'm going to focus a little bit about the math that we're going to be doing here, just so that you understand some of these terms. Okay, so remember, you're not going to have to memorize any of these equations for the AP Biology exams, but you do need to be able to understand them. So first of all, there is a difference between births and birth rate, and deaths and death rate. So a lot of times we are going to be focusing on the rate of the change, which is little r. And there's lots of different ways that you can calculate that. So one of the ways that you could calculate r is you could take the total births minus the total deaths and divide by the total population. Or another way that you could do is another way you could do is just to subtract the birth rate minus the death rate. And so there are other ways to calculate this as well, but those are two ways that you could do that. So remember, as far as the symbols that are used in these equations, is that capital B is births and lowercase b is per capita birth rate. So that is the birth rate. Capital D is deaths, and lowercase d is the death rate. N is usually the number of individuals, right? So one of the things we just talked about is the rate of the population growth, which is R, is the birth rate minus the death rate. We also talk about little d could also be referred to as the mortality rate. Sorry about that. And sometimes we use little m for that. Instead of saying death rate, we'll talk about mortality rate, which is basically the same thing. So I've worked out a little practice problem for you right here, so you might want to pause the video and work through that problem and make sure you can calculate the rate for the population growth for this practice problem. So another thing that we are going to be interested in learning is how you can express mathematically the population growth rate. And so what we are looking at is that triangle thing is a delta. So that means delta n, or the change in the population over the change in time, right? So the delta n over delta t is the change in population size over a certain change in time, and that is going to equal the births minus the deaths. Births and deaths can also be expressed as the average number of births and deaths per individual during a specific time. So for example, births could be the birth rate times the population rate, and deaths could be the little m, remember that's mortality rate, or the death rate, times the population size. So those are other ways that you can get at those, the births and the deaths for a population. The rate, right, of the population growth is little r, and that is equal to the birth rate minus the death rate, okay, or the mortality rate. When r is equal to 0, that is what we call zero population growth. So that means that you're having births and deaths, but the rate of the births and the rate of the deaths is the same, right? So the rate of change is 0. So when we talk about population growth patterns, we're talking about two basic growths. We talk about a J curve, and an S curve. You might learn those when you were in biology. Or the exponential growth versus the logistic growth. And so I'm going to go a little bit more detail into those right now. So this dn over dt is basically looking at the rates, all right? And you don't need to be scared by those terms. Those are, basically mean the change in. And so the change in the population over the change in time, that expression, this whole expression here, you can kind of think of as a speedometer on a car. So a speedometer, if I'm going 60 miles per hour by my speedometer, that just means at that particular point in time under those conditions, I'm going 60 miles per hour. But that could change, right? So that's what this means. This is the change in the population over the change in time is equal to this rate, the growth rate times the population. So that's going to give me the curve in an exponential growth. Okay, so this is the equation for exponential growth. And I can see that the different steepnesses of my J curve depending on what R is. Okay, so here R is equal to 1, whatever the population growth is, and I've got a really steep J, right? I've got my slope is very steep there. Here I have my R is half that, 0.5, and I can see a little more lazy J, right? So my rate has been decreased. So we normally think of exponential growth rates, growth curves and graphs as something like any kind of population that's growing in a new habitat. There's plenty of, mates, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of food, and there's not a lot of competition. And so we just have this growth rate that just kind of explodes. And that's not sustainable, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute. But it also can be a rebounding population. So after, for example, hunting was banned for a certain population of elephants in a reserve, we saw an exponential growth rate in the recovery of that population for a short period of time. That was not sustainable, but we could see that for a short period of time. The other population growth curve is the logistic curve. And in this particular pattern, we see the population growing more slowly as it reaches its carrying capacity. So we know that exponential growth cannot be sustained for a long time, right? You would either have to increase the size, you would have to take away the waste products, you would have to make sure there was plenty of food and water. A more realistic population growth would be this logistic growth, or the S growth curve. And we have a limit to the population growth, and that's what we call the carrying capacity, and that is always uses the letter K. And that is the maximum population size that an environment can withstand without the environment being damaged, right? So if you go over K, if your population exceeds the carrying capacity, you can degrade the environment. And so the carrying capacity is going to vary with the abundance of the limiting resources for that population. So I want to look a little bit now about the mathematical model, the mathematical equation of the logistic expression for logistic population growth. And I want you to notice that it starts with the same exponential equation and then adds an expression, adds an algebraic expression that reduces the rate as n, the population, approaches k. All right? So here we have the change in population over the change in time equals Rn, right? So this part right here is my exponential growth. But now I've got k minus n over k. This whole thing is the new piece for logistic growth. So now I want you to just look at what's going to happen when n is two different sizes, okay? So again, you're not going to have to memorize this equation. You're going to have this equation every time, all right? But you need to know what happens when n is little and what happens when n is big, okay? When n is small compared to k, right, then this number is basically, you don't even look at it, and k over k is 1. And so basically you get to ignore this whole part and it looks exponential. So in other words, this is the beginning of the logistic growth curve. When n is small, it looks like the beginning of a J. When n starts to get very large, when n starts to get close to k, then this mathematical equation here is going to be 0, right? Or it's going to be very close to 0. If this is 0, 0 times Rn is 0. And so that means the growth rate is leveled out. Growth stops and it begins to get flat. The steepest part of my logistic growth curve is when N is about half K. All right, so that's going to be my steepest part of my growth curve right here. So looking at this with real live organisms, let's pretend we have a population of paramecia. So these are little protozoans that are they're little ciliates that are 1 cell big, and they would fit into an S-shaped growth curve depending, right? So we know some paramecium are competitors of other species so that they can compete for the same food and space, and they're also producing waste. And we also might have predation. So here we have a didinium, which is another protozoan that's actually smaller than the paramecium. It's really fun to watch them, and they can actually eat the paramecium. So we'll have some stressors on those populations. And so here we see a paramecium population in the lab that's going to follow the perfect S curve, right? It's going to start off looking like it's exponential growth, and then it levels off. Some populations, though, actually overshoot K, and then you would have a period of where you've got some dying off occurring, and then it's going to level out. So here I have a Daphnia population that's going to level out. I had an overshoot first, and then it levels out to K. So let's talk about some different strategies of organisms, right, in the way that they grow. And there's basically 2 big categories of strategies. There are some species that do a simulparity, or what we call Big Bang reproduction. So they reproduce all at once and then they die. So a great example of that for you to have for your hip pocket would be like salmon, right? So salmon, there's a certain time where they all, go upstream and they spawn and, they reproduce all, it's like one big reproduction event and then they all die, all right? Another strategy are species that exhibit idioparity or repeated reproduction. So they repeat offspring repeatedly like rabbits, all right? So high variable, unpredictable environments are more likely to favor Big Bang, right? Because you might not have another chance to reproduce. And more dependable environments may favor the idioparity or repeated reproduction. We also have 2 different categories of organisms that we call the K selection or R selection, right? And I put the scale on here because it's not always an either or, so it is a continuum. But K selected, you can kind of think of remembering this as the logistic, right? So K, the carrying capacity, is what we call density dependent selection. And so these are going to be organisms that have their life history traits that are more sensitive to population density and are not likely to have big numbers of offspring, and because they're focused on kind of the long haul. The R selected organisms are more, we say that's density independent selection. So I don't care how many other of organisms are there, I'm going to reproduce as much as possible, and those would be, if that was my strategy, I would be in R selection. So you can kind of get an idea about what kinds of organisms might be R and what kinds might be K. So R selected species tend to be small. There's usually a lot of them. They don't have a very long maturation phase. They have short life expectancy. And we'll see in a minute their survivorship curve is going to more likely to be type 3. If you are a K-selected species, you're more likely to be large, multicellular. You might not produce as many offspring. You might have a longer parental care, a longer life expectancy, and we would usually categorize you as the survivorship curve of type 1 or type 2. So what are these survivorship curves? So this is just a graphical way of looking at the K selection versus the R selection strategies. And then if you're on the survivorship curve 2, you're kind of halfway in between. So let's look at humans. We're K selection, or like elephants. So we we don't produce a lot of offspring, but the ones that we do produce survive for a long period of time, right? So we have a high survivorship and we have a longer lifespan. So we don't produce as many offspring, but we put a lot into them and we have a longer lifespan. And so that's our survivorship curve as humans. R selection organisms are going to produce a lot of offspring, but a lot of them die off. They don't parental, so here's some kind of mollusk, right? So it's not going to have a lot of parental care, and like those spawning salmon that we saw, those little baby fish are on their own, right? So there's no way, and a lot of them get eaten. And so they have their lifespan is not very long, and a lot of them die off. So if I was going to look at a population and I wasn't going to look at any immigration or emigration, right? So no organisms are coming into my population and no organisms are leaving, right? Because that's another way that we can increase or decrease our N. That we have this thing called an equilibrium density, and that's kind of Q. You can think of that as Q. And think of this blue line as kind of a teeter-totter, all right? And so when the population density is low, then the births are going to increase. They're going to be greater than, the birth rate is greater than the mortality rate. And so the population grows until it reaches this density, this equilibrium density of Q. When the population density is high, so when mortality rate is greater than the birth rate, then the population shrinks until it reaches that equilibrium density. So let's look at graphs of predator-prey relationships, right? So if we look at like wolves or moose, and you can pick any point in here and take a look at this, all right? So for example, if I see that the moose population is increasing, right? So here's my moose population. Then I see the wolf population takes off. But then as there's more wolves, I can see my moose population diving, right? And then the wolves are going to follow suit with that, right? Because there's going to be less food for them. So some of these predator-prey graphs are kind of interesting. And one of them is this very tight synchrony between the snowshoe hare population and the lynx. And this was following a 10-year cycle. So if you look at these peaks, you see about a 10-year cycle of these, and then of the snowshoe hare, and then the lynx was following suit. And for a while, it was really a mystery as to what was causing these very predictable 10-year cycles. And it goes way, way back to when we were, hunting these creatures for fur. We could actually look at the population numbers from way back when we were actually trapping them. So one of the hypotheses is that the hare's population cycle followed cycles of winter food supply. And so if that hypothesis was correct, then the cycle should stop if the food supply increased. And so researchers added additional food to a hare population, and the whole population continued to increase in size, but it was a cycling, okay? So obviously that data would not support that hypothesis. Another hypothesis was to look at the hare's population cycle and to see if it was driven by pressures from other predators. So the lynx is not the only predator of a snowshoe hare, right? So here I have a fox that is also another predator. And so scientists looked at that, and they concluded that 90% of hares were actually killed by predators. So that data supported that second hypothesis. Another hypothesis was that the hare population cycle is linked to sunspot cycles. So sunspots are periodic cycles in the sun's light intensity that tend to follow periodic cycles. Well, if you have more sunlight intensity, that's going to affect photosynthesis, right? Because that's more energy that's coming from the sun. And so researchers also found there was a good correlation between the sunspot activity and the hare's population size because the food was increasing. And so we figured this out about 20 years ago that both the sunspot activity and the other predators were affecting this cycle of the snowshoe hare population, and that in turn was affecting the cycle of the lynx. So we're going to finish up today talking about the human population curve. What kind of curve is that? That is definitely exponential growth, right? And I think what's really interesting about this is right here, you look at the plague, right? The bubonic plague that was hitting during the Middle Ages in Europe and in Eurasia. And look at that little tiny dip there, right? So that little tiny dip and all those millions of people that died did not stop our J curve, right? So human population growth. Today I checked, there's a really cool website that you can actually check the actual population, and as of today when I'm recording this lecture, that is the current world population, 7.8 billion people on Earth. Now I want you to look at this graph and tell me what is being projected here, because I just showed you the J curve that showed us going up, 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 but here I'm looking at something that's actually going down, right? So as you're an astute science student, you're going to look up here, this is the rate of human growth, right? The rate of human growth population is decreasing, but it depends on which country. So this is worldwide, but it depends on which country. So in order to maintain population stability, there's two things that you can do. To get zero population growth rate, you can either have a high birth rate, but also a high death rate, right? So if you take your birth rate minus your death rate, if those are the same, then you would have zero population growth. Another way that you could have zero population growth is to have a low birth rate and also a low death rate, and that would give you zero population growth. So obviously, for the sustainability of the Earth, we need to get to a zero population growth. Which one of these is the most humane way to control population? Obviously, it would be decreasing our birth rate and decreasing our death rate, right? Because we're humans and we care about each other. So those are outlining a demographic transition, right, to move to a more sustainable zero population growth. So if you look at each country, look at the demographics in these histograms of different countries. And I can see a population, the population growth in a country like Afghanistan that has a very young population, their population growth rate is 2.6. You look at the United States, it has a slow growth, and we have more stable, younger population, not as much as Afghanistan here, but we still have a slow growth rate. Ours is about 1%. And then you look at a country like Italy that has very low or lower number of young people in the reproductive ages, and they actually have a zero growth rate. So if we look at what we used to call industrialized countries and less industrialized countries and compare infant mortality and life expectancy, we can see that the industrialized countries have a way lower infant mortality rate than less industrialized countries. And our life expectancy is way higher than less industrialized countries. But I want to challenge you to stop thinking about the world in these binary vision of industrialized and less industrialized, because we're realizing now that that's not the way, that's not a true way of thinking of our population. And I just want to give a great shout out to a wonderful researcher named Hans Rosling. He passed away a few years ago, but he wrote a book called Factfulness that is really eye-opening. And he has been a very popular TED Talk speaker, and he talks about the best way to think about the world population is not with the haves and the have-nots, not the industrialized and the less industrialized, but think of it in 4 levels. level 1 populations, level 2 populations, level 3, and level 4. And you can see on this diagram that this is giving us an indication of what daily life is like for a level 1 in a level 1 population versus what daily life is like in a level 4 population, right? So look, for example, about food. How does food change? Look at cooking, right? Look at an open fire versus kerosene versus, actually a small stove that may be electric, or, a fully functional range like what we might have in the United States. Look at transportation. A level 1 country might just be based on just walking. A level 2 country might have bikes that you can pedal. Level 3 might actually have motorcycles. And a level 4 country would have a car. All right, so it just kind of gives you a better visualization of that. And so if you look at these different levels, level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4, level 1 populations would have less than $2, live less on $2 a day, and live in extreme poverty. Level 2 populations live on $2 to $8 a day. Level 3 lives on about $8 to $32 a day, and anything greater than $32 a day is level 4. I want you to look at the population, where that population is. Most people in the world are actually at level 2, and they're moving up. They're moving up to level 3, all right? And those people are moving up to level 4. So today, let's say 50 years ago, more than half the world's population lived on level 1. Think about that. 50 years ago, more than half the world's population lived here. Today, level 1 is only about 13% of the human population. So we are improving, and that has some really wonderful things, but it also has its own challenges. So I'm going to show you this quick little video. It's 4 minutes, and this is Hans Rosling, and this kind of gives it to you in a nutshell.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health, and I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before, animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubble showed the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only the UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind. Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Anytime you have a chance to see Hans Rosling on a TED Talk, you should definitely take that up. So I want to talk a little bit about the carrying capacity of the Earth. What is the carrying capacity of the Earth? What population can we hold? We're already consuming raw materials at 1.5 times the sustainability rate. And the energy demands are just going up. Like when Dr. Rosling was talking about moving to the healthy and wealthy corner, that's going to mean that we need to produce more and more energy. How are we going to produce that? That's going to be key, right? And what are we willing to give up? What about meat? What about farming? What about soil and water? So you think about all those people that are moving into the healthy, wealthy corner. We need to think about how we are growing sustainably. And especially when we think about things like climate change, when we think about energy demands. Are we going to produce electricity in sustainable ways, or are we going to use fossil fuels to produce that electricity when we know that that is going to end up damaging the Earth in tremendous ways long term? So we can talk about our ecological footprint. This is a concept that kind of summarizes the land and water that we need to be able to sustain people. And we can measure the ecological footprint of a person, or we can measure it as far as a country goes. And this is just one of the indexes that you can use to measure a footprint, and this is gigajoules of energy. Okay, so electricity. Think about how much we utilize electricity. And you would look at the countries that are the darkest maroon, right? So Europe and America and Australia, Canada. And you look at the countries that are bright red, like Russia. And then you look at the countries that are paler in color. All of those countries are going to have energy needs that are also going to be moving up. And again, this goes back to climate change, and this goes back to how are we producing electricity? Are we doing it in a sustainable way? Because if not, that's going to end up harming our Earth in the long run. Right now, the way that we are consuming resources, we would actually, in the United States, So if the whole world's population consumed resources like the United States, we would actually need 4 Earths to support everyone. And so as good global citizens, we in the United States need to think about how we can reduce our ecological footprint as the other countries and other peoples are trying to improve their health and wealth. We need to think about the resources on the earth as shared resources for everyone. Interestingly, we are not the biggest consumer country. And so you might want to go to this BBC article for the country that actually is a greater consumer than the United States. And I will give you a hint. It's one of the rich oil producing countries. So I'm going to end with 2 other quick little commercials for Dr. Rosling talk. This is a 8-minute version of his kind of low tech where he's talking about the different ways that different populations have moved, and it's fascinating. And then this is his original, which is the full 20-minute TED Talk. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll see you in class.